So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Burkhardt. She is an independent educational consultant and author. Sue's research interests include the role of both formative and summative classroom assessment in student motivation and achievement, the connection between classroom assessment and large-scale assessment and grading. She's been both an elementary and middle school teacher and a university professor. In addition to her consulting work, Sue currently serves as a senior research associate in the School of Education at Duquesne University. So I am very pleased and honored to introduce Dr. Susan Burkhardt.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks very much. As Jeff told you, the plan for today is to give you a definition of formative assessment and a description of what it is, and share a model of formative assessment that is based on 6 major strategies, and give you some examples of those strategies. And that is such a whirlwind to do in an hour and a half. Sometimes I do a day or 2 or 3 days on this same topic. So if you are left thinking, there's more to learn, you got it. Before we go into formative assessment definition, let me get a green marker here. Formative assessment is part of the whole balance of assessment that schools have to deal with. Classroom formative assessment strategies are formative in purpose and focused on the classroom. That differentiates them from grading, which is summative in purpose. That is, it certifies and reports what has been learned, and classroom focus. And it also differentiates classroom formative assessment from interim benchmark assessment or common formative assessment. We got some questions ahead of this webinar, and over half of them were about how classroom formative assessment is related to interim benchmark assessments or common formative assessment. So I want to take a minute to make sure you know that those are 2 different things, which one we're going to talk about today, and what characteristics distinguish them. Classroom formative assessment strategies are usually done for the purpose of both the student and the teacher figuring out where they're headed in their learning, where they are now, and what they need to do to make further improvement. Interim benchmark assessment or common formative assessment are usually for the teachers and administrators, the big people, as I like to say. They inform future planning, but they are not typically much used by students. For me, the big, huge, new, important thing about classroom formative assessment strategy is that the students also use the assessment information. That is consistent with educational psychology, with learning theory, and it's also where the formative assessment research is based. There isn't really a research base yet, much of one anyway, for common formative assessments, the more large-scale ones that are aggregated across classrooms. So in this lower left-hand quadrant is where we're going to live today. We're going to talk about in the lesson, in the learning, between teacher and student, formative assessment strategies that are not aggregatable across classrooms or students typically, and that are not done across classrooms. They're for individuals. I think people sometimes think this whole left side of the diagram here is one thing, and it's really not. I think what's missing sometimes is people not being able to see that there's a classroom dimension and a more large-scale dimension to different kinds of assessments. So now that you know we're going to live down here in this lower left-hand quadrant with in the moment, in the lesson, classroom formative assessment strategies, here we go. This is the definition that Jeff just told you was selected from among a large handful of definitions as particularly useful to practitioners, and that warms my heart because that's why Connie and I wrote it this way. However, the other definitions are good and interesting, and they are available in a handout that you'll be able to get after this webinar is over. I have put in blue there the things that I want to stress about the definition of formative assessment. One is that it's an active and intentional learning process. It takes planning. You have to ask questions. You have to listen to what students are thinking. You have to help students learn to focus on what they're thinking in order to get formative assessment information. Thing two, it's both teachers and students. If a teacher appraises a student, thinks something like, I need to ask that student to read aloud a little more, and then passes on to the next student without engaging the student at all in seeing what that's about, that's not really formative assessments as we're using the term today. The continuous and systematic evidence of learning is what makes it an assessment tool and not just good instruction. Formative assessment does blur the line between assessment and instruction, but it does take planning. You have to ask and answer good questions. You have to ask and answer questions that are tied to the learning target, and you have to think then about what does this mean for where the student is and where they should go next. So that's the definition. I wish I could sort of keep it up here as we go along, but I'm sure you can keep it in your head. Sadler, a long time ago, 1989, put together a paradigm for formative assessment that students appraise work against criteria. That criteria thing is a big deal. They need to know what they're looking for. Decide where improvement is needed and take action to improve. These days, people usually make 3 little questions that would be running in a student's head. Where am I going? Where am I now? What do I need to do next? That's the formative assessment paradigm. And if the student is not running that little script in their head, is not using the assessment information to think, I understand this, but I need a little more work on that, or I'm confused about this, then it isn't formative assessment because nothing will be formed in the student's head. So why formative assessment now? Well, you see this fellow here with the empty head. When my teachers taught me when I was a child, they really did think this was how students learned. They thought students were blank slates that you dumped information in, or they thought their lessons were stimuli to which students responded because they were behaviorists. They were taught to be behaviorists. That's how we thought people learned. But what the cognitive psychologists found in the 60s, 70s, and 80s through today is that students do a much more active thing when they receive information. They process it. They hook it to what they already know. They can go way off track, even in a good lesson, if they're hooking it to odd or funny misconceptions of what things that they already know. So if the students have to process the information, then the students also need assessment information to help them process. That's why teachers today talk about formative assessment. It wasn't that your teachers were trying to do you dirt. It's just that they didn't know that this is how students learn. So there is research, and there is some of it cited, that teachers who are expert in formative assessment are interested in what students are thinking. And then they consider what the students should think next, what experiences they should have next to help them process information. Whereas teachers who are not expert in formative assessment collect evidence of student performance, the old 80% correct or better. And then what they do, because this is all they know to do, is reteach topics based on the topics of most need. So where you score the lowest, you get to practice the more. That is sort of an old-fashioned strategy. Teachers always did that. What's new about formative assessment is this business of figuring out what students are thinking and then help them think better. one of the questions that we got in the pre-questions that people wrote in was to clarify the distinction between diagnostic and formative assessment. Formative assessment can be diagnostic if you do this thing about interpreting what students are thinking. Diagnostic assessment is an older term. It comes out of some of that more stimulus response kind of learning theory. And usually it's based, the diagnostic assessment is based on fairly formal tests that unpack in a sort of atomistic step-by-step version of what all the little things that a student needs to know in order to do this big thing, and then looks for where they are lacking. That's a woefully inadequate definition of diagnostic assessment. There are at least 6 different kinds. I have a whole textbook chapter devoted to that, but that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Diagnostic assessment and formative assessment are similar in spirit. Diagnostic assessment comes from terminology that's older and usually uses more formal assessments that are based on particular theories of how students learn particular things. So here are the 6 strategies that we're going to talk about today in our little whirlwind tour, if you have bought with me the idea that students need to be on this learning journey with us. We're going to start with sharing learning targets and criteria for success, because everything is based on that. Feedback needs to be based on the target and criteria. Student goal setting needs to be based on the target and criteria. Teacher questions need to be based on the targets and criteria. We're going to do these 6 things in 4 lumps, very quickly defining each one and giving at least one example. The first thing students need to learn is what they are supposed to be learning. Students who are pretty successful at school scope this out for themselves. The students who are helped the most are students who need to be scaffolded to learn, to figure out what they're supposed to be learning. So here's an example. If you were to think of yourself as a student and to think of this webinar as a lesson, the learning target might be something like, I can explain 6 formative assessment strategies. Notice that it doesn't say you can practice 6 formative assessment strategies, because I'm not giving you any chance to practice anything. I'm just presenting. And notice, too, that this is not going to be a true learning target, because if it were, I would have to ask you to explain the formative assessment strategies. So you would get your formative assessment evidence of how well you did it, and I would get evidence of how well you did it, too. Both, it's not enough just to have an I can statement. Anybody can write an I can statement. A lesson that truly has a learning target also has a performance of understanding built in, where the students can get evidence of what they're supposed to be learning, and as they do it, practice learning it, and also apply criteria that you give them. How will I know I can explain these 6 formative assessment strategies? Since that's the part that's going to be missing from this webinar, because it is a webinar and not a lesson, I would say we don't have a true learning target. But if I had to write what it would be in a workshop, that would be it. Please note, you don't have to start a learning target with the word I can. Sometimes people say we are learning too. Sometimes people just make really good descriptions of content hooked very clearly to really good performances of understanding and criteria. As one of my teacher friends says, the tyranny of the I can statement is just not true. And if you belong to a building where the principal wants to see an I can statement on the board for every lesson, tell him, well, that's good as far as it goes. But that he or she will know you have a learning target when they ask a student, what are you trying to learn? And the student has a fairly cogent answer. And the next student has a fairly cogent answer. And the next one. The learning target isn't a learning target unless students are aiming for it, no matter what you have on the board. So communicating a learning target starts with a statement often, but it must quickly progress to how you're going to help the students begin to aim for it. A learning target for a lesson also needs to fit into a learning trajectory that goes somewhere. It needs to come from yesterday's lesson. It needs to build on yesterday's lesson, even if it's, well, we're learning to do main idea. Yesterday we pulled main idea out of a much simpler piece of text. Today we have a more challenging piece of text. So the performance of understanding changes, so the learning target changes. And you're going somewhere. Where are you going? In this case, to some standard that says students can get main idea out of everything they read, not just the text for today. But the idea is that the right learning target is the one that puts itself next in line for what the students need to learn, and that the students understand why today we're doing this, because yesterday we did that, and tomorrow we're going to do the next thing. So here are some characteristics of a learning target. It describes exactly what the student will learn at today's lesson in developmentally appropriate language that students can understand from the point of view of a student who has yet to master the content. That's just the statement itself. It then needs to be hooked to something that students will do, make, say, or write. Because when the kid goes home and mom or dad says, "What did you learn in school today?" they are going to tell them what they did. Students experience lessons from the point of view of being seated in that chair. And they need to be able to answer the question, why am I sitting in this chair today? What am I supposed to be learning? Not just at the end of the unit when I reach that standard, but what am I supposed to be learning today? And they need to see that not only in the statement, but what you ask them to do. And you also need to tell them what to look for. When you tell them what to look for, those criteria for success should describe mastery, not scoring. For instance, it should be something like, I will know that I can write a good descriptive paragraph when I can pick out a lot of descriptive adjectives in my paragraph, not when my teacher gives me at least a 3 on the 4-point rubric. So let's do some examples. I don't have a lot of time, but I needed a couple examples. Here's a kindergarten one. This little boy has just learned to make an A-B pattern. The learning target would have been, I can make an A-B pattern. But it wouldn't have been any good for the teacher to just say that. What she had to do was have the student actually make the pattern. And this little boy has given himself and the teacher evidence that he can do it. The look-fors would have been, my pattern goes yellow bear, blue bear, yellow bear, blue bear, yellow bear, blue bear. This is also a slide I like to use because it also gives you that assessment idea of sampling and how much evidence you need. If that little boy had just put up 1 yellow bear and 1 blue bear, we wouldn't be nearly as sure that he could do an A-B pattern as what he's done right there, where there's clearly enough evidence that you can see and he can see he can do an A-B pattern reliably. So the point of the slide is it's all of that. It's not just I can make an A-B pattern. It's the statement and the lesson he did and the evidence he's produced for himself and the evidence that he's produced for you and what he knows to look for in that evidence that makes him sure and you sure that he can do the A-B pattern. For the high school example, I picked a counterexample. This is a true story. It was reported to Connie and myself by a high school administrator. He saw a high school teacher teaching this learning target that you see there. I can identify character attributes from reading a piece of text. And they went through some examples together. The idea was that what a character says or does gives you clues about who they are in a story. And the performance of understanding was that the teacher put the students together in groups of 4, and each group got an old purse filled with stuff. Their task was to dump the stuff on the desk and write a 1-paragraph character description of who the person who carried that person, whose stuff that was, who that person probably was. Well, the principal came to us and he said, I am so conflicted. He said, that's a really cool activity. But do you see the problem? That is not a performance of understanding for getting character attributes from reading a text because there's no text. And yet he didn't want to come down on the teacher who had a good idea. But it wasn't a performance of understanding. So he suggested to the teacher that if she wanted to use that cool activity as a sort of what we would have years ago called an anticipatory set, a little warm-up kind of thing, to make the point that you can tell a lot about a person from their stuff, that would, for 5 minutes, that would have been cool. But in order to know if I can identify character attributes to read a piece of text, that's what I got to do. So this example is a counterexample. Jeff, do you have some learning target questions for me?
Couple that we'll go ahead and deal with. It may be that you're going to cover this material a little later in the presentation, so we'll take them and we'll see where we are. First one is, given your definition of formative assessment, should a teacher put a formative assessment score in the grade book?
Okay, the short answer is no. But it is more complicated than that, as you, Jeff, are well aware if you teach formative assessment and grading. A formative assessment is not a score that is reified. Pardon me. I have a cold. I was not going to tell people that, but I guess the cat's out of the bag now. If you put a formative assessment grade in the grade book, it absolutely, positively must be redeemable, reformable, replaceable. That is not typically the way I recommend doing it. I recommend formative assessments that are not graded but get feedback, and then summative assessments with the possibilities of revision or redo according to classroom policies that you and your students have gone over. But I do know that there are some people who call it a formative assessment when they put a tentative grade in the grade book. The formative assessments I'm talking about are much more graded, much more appraised with feedback than with scores. Or if they are given scores, it's one of those, if I had to take a grade now, it would be a 3. Now here's what we can do to get you to a 4.
Very good. And here's a question, and I actually got this in the training I was doing today. To what extent is using a formative assessment process with learning targets teaching to the test?
Oh dear, we only have 1 more minute in the question period, and that's not fair, because I have a whole soapbox for this. We are teaching to a learning goal. You teach, for instance, this slide I still have up, identifying character attributes from reading a piece of text is a learning goal. If there is a test over that, and surely there are many of these, it would be a sample of all the possible things you could ask students to do, make, say, or write to identify character attributes from a piece of text. And that's not what you teach to. Teaching to the test is teaching to those samples of behavior. I know they're going to ask about Moby Dick. So I am going to teach these kids about Captain Ahab's character because I know they'll have to write about that. That is not teaching to a learning target like you're looking at there, identifying character attributes from reading. Teaching to learning targets should be teaching to a little domain. Now, the daily learning targets are little tiny domains, but they're still domains, and tests are samples. That's probably not as clear as it should be because I should give a whole bunch of examples of samples as opposed to domains, but Jeff, we don't have the time. But that's the answer. It is the witching hour for the feedback one. Should I go on, or do you have one more quick juicy question? Okay, here we go. So feedback. Feedback that feeds forward describes the work's strengths and makes one suggestion for a next step. That's why it feeds forward. If all you do is tell students what they did or what they need to fix, you are looking backward. To be formative, the feedback needs to draw the student into the future learning. Now, I said one suggestion. It could be 2. It could be 3. It depends on the student. But the issue is that the students should know what they did well. We often forget to tell them that. And do something that kicks a student forward, that helps them take a step forward, that is not so much that it would be overwhelming and they won't take any steps at all. So teachers who have this great need to sort of comment on everything that they want to see fixed, typically that's not a productive strategy because the students think, oh my goodness, and they don't do any of it. The other thing that this really implies is that if there is not going to be time for the student to use the feedback very, very soon, if not immediately, then don't bother giving the feedback. This idea that you're going to give feedback and the students will somehow remember it and use it next time, this is what teachers always tell me, is not true. Even good students who really want to, that's not how learning works. You need to give them an opportunity to use the feedback. The feedback that just tells them what's wrong is basically describing why they got lost points on a grade. That's not the time for feedback. It's during the formative phase that feedback is useful because there's still time for amendment of life. At the end, all the feedback does is explain to the student why they got the grade they did. So a feedback that feeds forward does do those first two things that I said, and that's not just my own brilliant idea. There is research to prove that, and I've cited a couple of very long literature reviews of the feedback literature there for your reading pleasure. And I also, it's not going to be possible for me to say, and here's how you write good feedback, because you also have to differentiate feedback for different students' needs. So some students just need to be reminded. This set of reminder scaffolding and example feedback, that's Shirley Clark's work, actually, just to give her credit for that. So reminder feedback is maybe I'm walking past the desk and a student is writing a perfectly good paragraph, but there aren't enough descriptive adjectives in it. And all I have to do is remind her, because I know she writes well, and I know that she knows what descriptive adjectives are, because I've been watching her work all week. So I just need to say, well, Tanya, remember this is a really descriptive paragraph. And she says, oh, descriptive. It reminds her of the learning target, and she goes back. She knows she needs to stick in those descriptive adjectives. That's all she needed was a reminder. So I walk past the next desk, and I see another student who doesn't have enough descriptive adjectives in his descriptive paragraph. And I know from reading his previous writing that he doesn't usually use a lot of descriptive adjectives. So for him, I scaffold the feedback a little with some questions. Okay, so here, Rod, you're describing your dog. What does your dog look like? What does your dog sound like? And as he answers the question, oh, yeah, barky. That's a really cool adjective. Why don't you say your dog is barky? Why don't you put that in there? By asking scaffolding questions, you help the students. That's feedback that this student needs. If you started to do that with Tanya, who just needed to be reminded, she'd be rolling her eyes, saying, I know. And she would also be thinking, she thinks I don't know what descriptive adjectives are, and I do. So you have to be mindful of what your students need. Then for the students who really, really have no idea where to start, they need detailed examples. You might have to go back to even reteaching. If the student needs too many examples, don't be dumping that all in feedback. Reteach. But in the case of the scenario I'm running here with the descriptive paragraph, you might give them a sentence or two with lots of descriptive words in it and say, now, would you like to use a sentence like that? Could you write a sentence like that? So feedback describes the work strengths and then makes at least one suggestion, but how you make those suggestions, you have a whole toolbox for how to do that. Reminders, scaffolding with questions, or a whole full-blown example. There are 3 ways to look at feedback. I like to use 3 little icons. You can do the micro view, the snapshot view, or the long view. And if you don't have all of them, you don't have good feedback. The micro view are these characteristics that research, including the reviews of literature that I cited, say feedback needs to do. It needs to be descriptive, timely, contain just the right amount of information, not too much, use clear criteria, focus on the work, focus on the process, be positive. Now, that positive doesn't mean you say something is good when it isn't. It's positive to give constructive criticism. Clear, specific. Imply that this, now as a writer, what were you trying to do here? Not fix this. The tone makes a big difference. And those are all absolutely essential. But that's not all. That's just what you look at. These are your criteria for your word snippet. Here's an example. This is a bad example I mocked up. This is a fourth grader. The writing prompt was, a book went missing from the library. Would you write a letter to your librarian, please, explaining why you want this book back in the library, why that librarian should buy the book again? Well, notice that this bad feedback simply corrects what the student wrote. You acted as a copy editor. The student could simply copy over what you did and not learn anything except this is what the teacher asked for, so this is what I'll give them. This is a fourth grader. This is not a very good paragraph for a fourth grader. This is a student who needs some serious help. This is not going to help them. This might get you something minimally competent that you could enter in your grade book, but it wouldn't teach the student to be minimally competent. So here's a better example. Same paragraph. And I do have to say, I would not write all this feedback. I'd write the first two sentences and say the rest. I put it all on a slide because I needed it to be up on a slide for this presentation. But one of the things that this previous feedback did not tell the student is that he actually did some stuff that's pretty good. They were asked for reasons, and he said his book was funny and it had mysteries in it. Those are perfectly good reasons to want a book in the library. And the student needs to know that that is a strength. He did that right. So that's the first thing the feedback does. It names and notices what the student did well, and then asks a feeding forward question. Can you add the name of the book and explain why these reasons are important? Notice I chose to ignore the fact that this isn't in letter form and to ignore some of the copy editing kinds of things because these are more important to me. And if I put all of that in, the student will simply say, oh, there's way too much to do. I can't do any of it. And then, because this is a struggling student, I would use an example prompt. For example, I feel, how do you feel when I read funny stories? You could put in a sentence like that. Or you could use another example. Mysteries are great because, and then you say why mysteries are great. So you give him examples to go on because this is a struggling student. And that's the kind of scaffolding he needs in his feedback. And just to be clear, I would not write all of this in the to the student. I would only write the first two sentences. I'd end with that question mark and do the rest orally. But you also need for feedback to be an episode of learning. If both you and the student don't learn something from the feedback, there is no, it's not going to feed forward. So in this episode, the student learns that his grammar is crummy and that he wrote a bad paragraph and he needs to copy it over. And you learned what all he can't spell and what all he left out. In this episode, the student learns he did a couple of things that were actually pretty cool. He now needs to add more about each of them, and we hope he learns that he probably can. What the teacher learns is that this kid knows at least a little something about what makes a book good to read and is able to say so. As an episode of learning, I won't even ask you which one you think is better, because I set that up to be real obvious. Effective feedback needs to create a little episode of learning, a little snapshot. That's why I use the camera lens as my metaphor. And then it also needs to say what next steps should the teacher and student take to use this feedback for learning. So believe it or not, this is a high school example. It's a real one, which is why it's hard to read. And I'm not going to expect you to read all of it. But again, I chose an example of a not very proficient 11th grade student because that's where it's easy to go so wrong with the feedback and just do all of that copy editing. So this teacher actually did say some positive things. He or she, I don't know, I just got this in the packet, submitted with a bunch of examples. I don't know which teacher it was. Your examples are good and specific. You have a topic sentence, but it could be a little stronger if you specify what you are referring to. You see that the students started this writing, which was supposed to be about a book, with ifs, and it was about a story, I'm sorry, not a book. And if he had simply said this story is called A Rose for Emily, it would have been better. The teacher actually gives an example there because the student needs it. This is a very low-performing student. And then the teacher goes on to say some other things that could actually make the student think a little bit more about what he's going to write and write it better. That's what we mean by feeding the student forward. And then, and I don't know because the packet didn't contain this information, if this student does not have an immediate chance to rewrite this Rose for Emily theme, all of this feedback will be for naught. I am heartily encouraged to see that this is not graded, this is just feedback. And I hope and pray that this was a draft and that the next draft will be better based on this feedback. But if the teacher just gave the students a score and wrote this feedback to be used in the eternal next time, nothing will happen. So so 3 views of feedback: the micro view, all those little wordsmithing things you should know about; the snapshot view, evidence of learning for both you and the student; and the long view, the telescope. Where are you going? What is in the future?
And now, if we may, this one goes back to our first segment, but it's an interesting question. This participant wrote, "We know that it is important to know about learning goals in the formative assessment process. However, what is the role of collecting and using information about the learner in the formative assessment process?"
Well, I touched on that a little bit with my differentiating of feedback. When you give feedback, you have to know about the learner you're giving it to, or you can misfire. Although that's not bad, because usually if you misfire, they'll tell you. They'll say, "I don't understand this," or they will, depending on the age of the student, they may do the eye roll or whatever. But one of the things that you do when you plan a learning target is take into account the learner. A learning trajectory from yesterday to today through tomorrow for a given student or a given group of students may be different from class to class. Maybe your class needs to spend another day on descriptive adjectives, whereas my class is ready to move on to using those descriptive paragraphs in service of setting up a setting for a story or whatever's coming next in their trajectory. So, but even the learning goals themselves at the level of daily learning targets should take into account the learner. This is another way in which daily lessonly, that's not a word, but you know what I mean, lessonly learning targets are different from the standards that they ultimately go to. Everybody ultimately needs to get to that standard, but the lessons they need to go through may be different from student to student or group to group or class to class. So we're going to talk about 2 strategies together in this next chunk, student goal setting and self-assessment. A goal is something specific the student is trying to learn, not something the student is trying to score. I'm going to get all A's on my report card next term is admirable, but that's not a learning goal. A goal in the sense we're talking about is something like, you know, I always have a hard time thinking of what ideas I'm going to write about. I'm going to work harder at brainstorming before I start to write so that I have more ideas to choose from and more interesting stuff to write. Now that's a goal. Goals are not, they shouldn't be something you can do at one period, one lesson, one short spurt, because that's too easy. But it shouldn't be something that you can't get to after some work in a reasonable amount of time, and how long reasonable is differs with age and grade level. But a goal is something specific that the student is trying to learn, typically cued off of their daily learning targets. Like the example I just gave. They've done a bunch of writing and they've noticed this about themselves. Goal setting is a cognitive process. It's part of student self-regulation. I've given you some research references there. The self-regulation literature says that students can't self-regulate. There is no such thing if there is not some sort of forethought and planning, which is what I think Kittredge's phase is called, but some sort of goal setting or target setting phase. You can't regulate in a vacuum. You don't know where you're going. The goal has to be just right, not too hard, not too easy. Then you have to have a strategy to get there. And many students have trouble with this strategy thing. They typically need to learn something because their strategies maybe aren't as effective as they'd like. And teachers can help with that. And then they use their strategies to monitor their own performance. And that is, and then at the end, they actually, the self-regulation paradigm that the authors I've got up there use has a fourth phase where it's called reflection, where students ask themselves, so did I get there? Do I still have more to go? But this is it is definitely a cognitive process. It involves the student in processing things, in digesting things, to use our commenters. And you can help a lot as a teacher to foster student goal setting, in addition to providing lessons where you actually have them set goals, which I highly recommend, by the language that you use. Say things like, what are you trying to learn, not what are you doing? Say, what resources do you need, not what did you find in the library? Say things like, what were you thinking as a writer when you described that noise, not why'd you write that? Language is very powerful, and we often, without thinking, because it's just what's easy for us to say, we often imply to students that they are the consumers of the lessons that we teach. And if you're going to have goal-directed students, they need to be the producers of the learning that is enabled by the lessons that we teach. If I could just do one thing, if I had a magic wand to wave over all teachers who wanted to do formative assessment, this is what I would do. It wouldn't have anything to do with strategy or methods or writing better questions. It would be learn to look at learning through the eyes of the student, not through the eyes of the teacher planning the lesson. Golly, is that hard, because you are the teacher planning the lesson. And so that's your first instinct has to be, okay, what am I going to do? But if you could just not do that and think, what is the student going to need to experience? What is the student going to need to hear? Then everything you do would be formative. And Connie's and my 6 strategies, or other authors I read have 5 strategies. I know an author has 7 strategies. They would all, those aren't theory, those are practical strategies. The theory is it has to be through the eyes of the student. That's what the research says, that's what self-regulation says. So I guess we need an example here. This one is actually from a 4th grade speech therapist. And the teacher writing on the left there is stuff she wrote to me. But she made this little chart, and the student was learning to say the sound TH. So she got to color in, I can say my sound by itself, I can say my sound in the beginning of words, the end of words, the middle of words, in phrases. And her first goal was I can use my sound in sentences. The teacher helped her set that goal. I love this example because it's got two goals on it. It shows that you set the goal wherever is reasonable for a student to get, and then you set another one. So the goal wasn't to hit the top of to hit the gong, which is what the scoring-oriented people would want. The goal was that, yeah, what are some things we think she can get to in a reasonable amount of time, and that's what she did. Now we've set a second goal that she needs to use her sound correctly every time she talks. And she's got one step to go before that to use the sound correctly when she uses. That was a goal set individually between a student and a teacher sitting at a table. But you can do many things like that with students in classrooms, and I think I have an example of something like that coming up. But I also promised you some words about student self-assessment. And this isn't really a chicken and egg, as I don't really care if you think of it as students setting a goal and then assessing their way toward it, or if you think of students assessing their work and then finding out from what they think of what their work looks like, what they need to do as a goal. It's reciprocal. It happens both ways, and there is no use, in my opinion, fighting about it. But students should review their own work in light of criteria and then decide on the next step. Now let's stop for a minute and be real clear that this assumes that the students understand the criteria for success, or what Tanya and I call student look for. They have some idea of what good work toward their particular learning target or targets looks like. If they don't have criteria, all they can do is look at their work and either think score, did I get them right? Or they can think, if it's a project of some sort, they can think, well, did I like it? Or did I follow the directions? The only way that they can review their own work formatively for learning is if they know what to look for, what criteria they should look for. What does a good descriptive paragraph look like? What does good two-digit subtraction look like? What does a good lab report look like? What does clear understanding of the rotation and revolution of the planet look like? Whatever it is they're supposed to learn, they need to know how it shows up in what they do. And you, the teacher, who were just feeling like you maybe gotten your burden lightened a little because the students are going to help you aim for the learning target, you just got a job to do here. It's your job to help communicate clear criteria. Sometimes students can help you come up with the criteria. That works if they know a little bit already about what they're learning. But in my experience, the hardest part of teaching formative assessment skills to teachers is having them come up with good criteria that are not just scores or lists of whether the kids follow the direction. You also need to teach students self-assessment skills. We've all seen that little first grader who has that little checklist: does my sentence start with a capital, does my sentence have a period, does my sentence express a complete thought, whatever it is. And he puts down that little checklist and he just goes check, 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 all three checks, doesn't even look at his sentence. Why? Because you gave him a checklist, so he's checking. You need to teach students how to match qualities of their work with criteria, rubrics, checklists, questions, however you do it. And then you need to actually give them feedback on how good they are at doing that. That's a learning to learn skill. And once you have them start down that path, they will want to get good at it, because kids want to know about themselves. Everybody's motivated to talk about me, me, me. And the students really do want to do well. But applying, it's an application skill to look at a piece of evidence, student work, and apply criteria to it. And just like any other higher order thinking skill, you have to teach it. So here's how you do it. There's a little list there. Students can develop their own criteria. They can be given criteria and assess their own work. You can give students feedback on how well their self-assessments are honing in on things they actually need to assess. And that last one is so important. Give them opportunities to practice self-assessment and revise regularly. Some teachers think if the students have a rubric at the beginning of an assignment, they'll use it. No, some of them will use it. But you build in opportunities right in your lessons where students have to not only use the rubrics, but explain their reasoning. Help each other use the rubrics. Explain to you all sorts of things you can do. But you have to teach self-assessment or it won't happen. This example of self-assessment, I took it from a high school example here. I've been trying because I had so few spots, for example, that I wanted to put some elementary and some high school examples. So this is a self-assessment on some volume and temperature problems in a high school chemistry class. There were, I think there were about 10 of these questions. This is just the first page. And the self-assessment was, in case the students didn't know it was one, the teacher actually labeled it self-assessment. And it's a frequency, it's a rating scale with a frequency scale. So there are some criteria down the side that the teacher wanted the students to do in each of these problems. And then the teacher wanted the students to assess their own completion of the skill on the set of problems. Did I do it on all problems, most problems, some problems, or none of the problems? Now, if I'm this student and I do this self-assessment, it is very clear to me that the very next thing I need to do before I turn this paper in is go back and write some more Charles law equations. And then if I have time, I need to go back and check whether I check each problem to make sure that I've converted Celsius to Kelvin and got all the information in there. This, just the visual layout of it sort of gives the students some help in using the self-assessment. And I think this is a very versatile format. I have seen other teachers in other subjects use, with different criteria down the side, use versions of this in lots of different grade levels and subject areas.
What if the students don't buy in?
Okay, that is a question without a lot of meat on it, so I'm going to use it to go in a couple directions. One is, in classrooms that have been highly evaluative, where teachers are typically heard saying things like, you have to know this because you'll be graded on it, or this will be on the test, then if you all of a sudden say to students, now you need to be aiming for a learning target, they won't believe you. That's because you taught them not to. And there are some very well-intentioned teachers that teach like that. There are also some high school teachers who want to blame the elementary school teachers and say, well, they come to us wanting these grades, and it's just too late now. We can't. And I'm here to tell you, I have seen teachers who can turn that around. So the first thing you have to do is change classroom culture. So yeah, we really are learning. They won't buy in if it doesn't match, if it seems like you're saying one thing but you're doing another. The other comment that I can make about this is this learning target thing we have to take seriously. If you are really just telling them this is your learning target and expecting them to buy in as a proactive process on their part, oh, that's my learning target, well, by golly, I'll do that, you won't get a whole lot of followers. You have to design lessons that show them, that set up the target for them, put the bow and arrow in their hand, and compel them to fire. The lesson has to have a learning target. It has to be clear by what you ask them to do in the lesson that, yes, indeed, that must be what I have to know because I need to know it to do this work. The criteria need to be clear. They need to be always there. And it needs to be clear to a student that once they accomplish something, they know it and you know it, and it moves them on to the next step. that's a CCCC change for many, many teachers who have done this sort of evaluative directions following approach to lesson planning because that's how it was done for them and it worked for them. If you in fact do that culture change and it's genuine, more students will buy in than don't. I guarantee it, but it's hard.
And if I may just add a comment, I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen it happen in my classroom. It will totally change the conversation in the classroom. Kids will buy into this. The only other question we have is about the amount of time goal setting and tracking takes away from instruction. There's a concern about that.
Okay, I would argue that the slide that is up on your screen actually took the kid a minute or two to do, maybe 5 if they went back and seriously looked at all the problems, but I doubt it. I think we're looking at a couple of minutes, and I think it would buy back at least more than a couple of minutes in higher achievement and better work that you don't have to go over again. I have seen elementary school kids track their, you know, those little time tests, the 100 facts, when they're learning the addition tables and the subtraction tables and multiplication tables. For 10 minutes every Friday, they color in what they got and they predict what they'll do next week and make a little plan for what they're going to do. I have seen, I'm thinking of a 9th grade class where students had basically a big rubric on the board, and for less than a minute as they were walking out of class, they each took a little Sharpie and put a little dot where they thought they were on the rubric today, and of course that would be anonymous, and only the kid would know whose dot was who. And then the next day they put a dot where they thought they had gotten to, so there was this class tracking like a bunch of little bugs or something on the rubric, but it was this class swarm moving toward competence that they did as they walked out the door. There are ways you can do this without, and sometimes you want to give them 10 minutes and a notebook and say do some serious reflection, but not all the time.
And I believe those are the questions we have for that segment.
Okay, and it's 4:05, so it's time to move on. The last segment is about teacher and student questioning. And I always get questions about, is questioning strategy, is that really a formative assessment strategy? Or isn't that just, you know, good questioning as part of good instruction? Well, the answer is yes, it is, if you are using it to get evidence of what students are thinking. Remember, what makes anything an assessment strategy is that it gives evidence of learning. And you will know what students are thinking only to the extent that you ask for it. If you ask a student, what's the capital of Montana? And a student says, Helena, you will know that one student knows one fact. That doesn't get you very far with student thinking. If you use open-ended, or even if they're closed questions, chewy ones, but I recommend open-ended ones, that elicit students thinking, that is a win-win for you and the student because you get to hear what's going on inside that head. If it's good reasoning, then the whole class, or the whole group, whatever you're asking the question in, just heard a student language version of an explanation of something important in class. Presumably, you're only asking important questions. If it's a question that makes you, that you can infer the student is not thinking real clearly about something, then you have evidence of what it is they need help thinking about. So it's no lose. And let me get my lovely, I love that, just clip art off the internet, but I love that question. If you use open-ended questions, and there's some research about the power of open-ended questions to help students think, and also this is what open-ended questions do. They do what this picture says. It gets students thinking out from inside the kid's head and into the air in words that you can hear, that others can hear, so that you can respond to it. You can give feedback. You can ask another question. Well, Sammy, what do you think of what Sally just said? Or, George, can you think of another reason that we might want to do this? So that the student's thinking turns into the evidence that you then appraise, that you give feedback on, that the students can hear themselves talking and can think about. In that sense, yes, it's a formative assessment strategy. So use open-ended questions. I didn't put together slides on what's an open-ended question because I think the people listening to this webinar probably know what that is. But real fast, a closed question is one that has one right answer, kind of like, so it is like the question I just said, what's the capital of Montana? Open-ended questions have several good answers. The answer would make student thinking visible. It would be a question like, can you think of some reasons someone might want to live in Helena, Montana? Now, that's an open-ended question. There are several good answers to that. There are also several not so good answers to that. Open-ended doesn't mean anything goes. It just means there are multiple ways in. Now, if you're going to ask open-ended questions, how you ask them is important. Because if you say, Jeff, and then ask that question, think about it. Every kid in that class whose name is not Jeff just said, I'm off the hook. I don't even need to listen to the question. So call on students randomly, and I literally did see a high school math teacher once use the random number generator and calculator to call on students randomly. I tried it. I can't do it fast enough. But if they don't verbalize, if they don't internalize, the people doing the talking are the ones doing the learning. Special ed teachers like this because their kids get called on this. Some people don't like cold calling. It tends to be people whose classroom climate is still a little bit evaluative, so people don't, students that are called on feel like they have to give a great answer or they need to be embarrassed. And I certainly wouldn't call on students randomly all the time. But do not call on the student whose hand is up, who's going, ooh, 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 me, because that student wants to talk and has an answer. Call on students, ask them to take some time, no hands up. Open-ended questions require thinking. If somebody sticks a hand up right after you ask an open-ended question, that in itself is evidence that they haven't really thought about the answer. Call on students randomly at least some of the time. Actually, there are some iPad apps for randomizing students' names, too. There's just all kinds of things you can use. Even better, because calling on students randomly still only calls on one student and leaves the other 24 sitting there not answering. Use a method that calls on, if you will, all students to answer, like whiteboards. So ask the question, have everybody write their answer and hold it up. Or like letter cards, A, B, C, D, so you ask a multiple choice question that you've prepared ahead of time, and you have each student hold up their answer. Or if you have automated response systems, which some people call clickers, you can do it that way. But any method that gets everybody to answer is better than randomly calling on just one. I want to caution you about one of the very famous ones, the thumbs up, thumbs down one. Watch for crowdsourcing of the answers. If I'm a student and I'm a little bit embarrassed and I don't know what I'm doing, but I know my neighbor is a pretty good student, I'm going to look at his thumb, and my thumb's going to do what his thumb does. There are ways around that. One is to use the thumbs up, thumbs down on opinion type questions. One is to have students do thumbs up, thumbs down in front of their bodies so that only you can see it. Like if little kids are sitting on a rug, the students around them can't see it. But another is to use methods like using a fist, almost like a Likert scale of 1 to 5, and have students vote on how strongly they think something is important or something like that, that it's where they won't need to feel like it's the right answer. Of course, the real answer is change the classroom climate so that students see being wrong as an opportunity to learn, and or ask more open-ended questions so that there isn't just one right answer. But I do need to tell you that all of these sort of mechanical things, oh, I'm using whiteboards, oh, I'm using thumbs, have been kind of co-opted by well-meaning people to do things that are not at all formative, and you do have to guard against that if you do that. The other thing that you want to do when you use open-ended questions is to extend wait time. An open-ended question that requires student thinking cannot be answered in an instant like what's the capital of Montana. Many teachers that I know of all grade levels, from kindergarten on up through 12th grade, have a no hands up time. And then probably the most famous and deservedly so way to call on students and give them some time to think comes from the cooperative learning literature. And it's think, pair, share, and all of its many variations. This is not just a cute strategy. This actually helps students process information. The think part is I'm sort of putting together my own answer. The pair part is I get to tell somebody my answer and I get to hear their answer, which means even if I ended up thinking my answer is not good, I have an answer that I can give if I'm called on because I just heard my partner give one. And then you share. There are myriad variations on this. Big pair, and then two pairs get together and share. The point is, when you use open-ended questions to get students thinking out into the air, you need to make sure you give the students time to think and don't jump to call on them. And extending wait time just by staring at them is often awkward. So think, pair, share, or something that makes them actively process is usually a good strategy. I need to quickly go through the fact that you should teach students to ask effective questions too. Students can learn the difference between literal and inferential questions. Sometimes they're called thick and thin questions. Sometimes they're called in the book and in my head questions. But you can teach students to ask open-ended questions. If you don't think so, check this out. This is a grade 5 child who read a book read an article about snakes and why there was a power outage. And look at the questions this kid, these were Post-it notes. These are just photocopies of Post-it notes. They had to write some questions about what they were reading, and then they had another Post-it note to draw a picture of something a picture that came into their head as they were reading. So again, open-ended questions are not just for advanced students who are very good at school. There are lots of strategies you can do to get students asking questions. There are a couple there. Question starters, prompts. There are lots of games you can play. There are all sorts of things students can make and write the questions on and throw around and have to answer the question that comes up. I am 1 minute over time, so I'm not going to belabor that point because a good practicing teacher could make up more of those strategies than I could tell you in this minute so that I can get to the high school example. This was a high school contemporary issues class in a Pennsylvania school, and a state senator was coming, and so there was an actual reason to write open-ended questions, and they did. If you took a minute to look them over, you would find that there are some really interesting thoughts there that they were going to ask their state senator.
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for participating. We really appreciate all your thoughts, your insights. We had some great discussion points, and we're looking forward to continuing this talk again in September. And that's it for today. Thank you again for joining our webinar.